when you go back and read Einstein, and anybody who hasn't read it should at least read his autobiographical essay in the Schultz volume, because it's very accessible and it's very nice. Einstein had very strong, clear physical intuitions about what he was doing, and also the way he thought physics was going. And he expressed them very clearly in some places. And one of those things in this famous letter to Born that he talks about was he looked back at physics starting from the ancient Greeks up to the late 19th century and said, oh, it seems to be getting more and more local, right? Where both the ontology is local, that is, if you just take a little piece of space or a little piece of space-time, you can specify what's going on in there independently of everything else. And the totality is just the sum of all those little regions. And he said in the dynamics, because when you write down a field equation like Maxwellian electrodynamics, the dynamics itself is also local. So I can determine whether the fundamental physical laws are being adhered to, again, just looking in any little region of space-time and not having to look outside of it. And this was Einstein's thought that gee, things, the tendency of physics is more and more local. And then quantum mechanics comes along, right? Well, Einstein also kind of invented quantum mechanics on top of everything else. But once the Copenhagen, the Bohr kind of thing starts up, where there's measurement seems to have some special status and it collapses the wave function and so on. And the wave function is in some sense a complete description. Einstein's objection to that from the beginning, and this is again, just historically, people get this entirely wrong. They think what he was objecting to was the indeterminism, but it's absolutely clear from the historical record, he was objecting to the non-locality, right? He was objecting from day one to saying, wait a minute, you're telling me doing an experiment here can collapse the wave function, which creates a physical change instantaneously, arbitrarily far away. And that's absolutely contrary to relativity and everything he'd been thinking. So at that point, he kind of jumps ship, and Schrödinger also agreed with him and didn't think any of this Copenhagen stuff made sense. And then we know the history after that, which was that Bohr was just better at organizing. I mean, he put together the Copenhagen school and he controlled a lot of resources, and he and Heisenberg and all these people, even if they had small disagreements among themselves, managed to form a pretty substantial block. And the dissenters like Einstein and Schrödinger didn't particularly much agree with each other, and they didn't operate collectively, right? Yes. They just went their own separate ways. And so this kind of Bohrian propaganda, took over. And then, as I like to say, I mean, early on, the Copenhagen thing was say a bunch of incomprehensible, weird philosophy and calculate. And then it came to the United States, and it was like, no, we need to make a bomb, right? Forget the first part, just shut up and calculate. And they, I don't think too many people will actually defend Bohr as having had deep insight, as opposed to this kind of weird, semi-mystical stuff he liked to say. And then you got to shut up and calculate. And of course, that's just, for a philosopher, or from my point of view, for a physicist, that's just a disaster. Calculating is boring, and doesn't give you insight. It doesn't answer the questions you're interested in.
Yeah, it's interesting. It seems like it coincided really well historically with around the time when philosophy and the sciences really began to split, not just from each other, but internally.
I mean, there's a split, but there's also a kind of weird, coincidental, unholy alliance between the logical empiricists who are, taking Hume's ideas, Hume's semantics, this kind of pure empiricist semantics, dressing it up in modern predicate calculus, right? And thinking, oh, they're going to debunk, they're either going to solve or debunk all traditional philosophical problems that way, right? Either here's the experiment to answer your question, or your question has no content. Right? So that's going on the philosophical side at exactly the same time this weird stuff is going on with Bohr on the other side. And then you can see all these kind of people who, operationists, who are very sympathetic to saying, look, the only thing that really has any content is talk about middle-sized objects and all this talk about what's really going on at microscopic scale, or, you know, is the electron really smeared out, or is the electron really moving, and so on. Those are just empty. It's not that they're hard to answer. Because I can't reduce them to an experiment by this very naive empiricist semantics, they're literally empty. And you know, Carnap is writing stuff that's just literally Hume rewritten.
Yeah.
So that there was actually this alliance between a particular strand of the early Vienna school, Vienna circle, and what was going on in physics at the time. Now, you know, the people trying to work out the philosophical side of it, like Hempel and so on later, and Carnap himself later, realized they couldn't do it, right? They realized the whole project falls apart and they couldn't complete it. But that news never got back to the physicists. And then at the same time, Popper's coming along with the same kind of deal, saying, look, you know, just if it's falsifiable, it's science, and if it's not, it's, you know, nonsense or whatever. And again, that was something that just gave them license to ignore these questions, fundamental questions that they should have been interested in.
It's a shame that logic is so disconnected from fundamental physics these days.
Well, you know, how much logic. So my, you know, what I always say is that mathematical physics has that name because you use mathematical objects to somehow represent physical reality. And the deep questions are about that representation relation, right? Well, how is this mathematical thing supposed to be representing physical reality? Which mathematical degrees of freedom are supposed to correspond to physical degrees of freedom? Which ones are just gauge? Is this supposed to represent an individual item or a collection, an ensemble, or, you know, a probabilistic? Is it a probabilistic thing? I think that's what's been ignored. How much literally logic, I mean, you know, Gödel's theorem or whatever, people somehow think Gödel's theorem is telling you something, which, you know, in physics, it's not. It's not telling you anything about physics. So I don't think pure logic has that much to do with it, but I do think thinking hard about mathematics, about mathematical structure and physical structure and the relation between them, that's where really interesting questions come up. But that's kind of why I've spent the last couple decades developing new mathematical tools, because I think, you know, this is, you need to ask yourself why you're using these mathematical tools as opposed to some others. And sometimes by some others, I mean, here's a brand new one, right? Try and use this, see what happens.